When reading the national security clause for the third time, Tru's hands began to tremble. This agreement was very different from what it appeared to be. The Chinese delegation was growing impatient, and his advisors were pressuring him to sign. But Traoré had noticed the fear in the translator's eyes. The Grand Conference Hall of Ouagadougou's newly renovated International Summit Center buzzed with anticipation. Representatives from major global media outlets positioned their cameras strategically, eager to capture what was being heralded as the investment deal of the decade. At one end of the massive mahogany table sat Ibrahim Traoré, his military uniform replaced with a simple but elegant African print suit for the occasion. At the other end sat Wei Jiang, CEO of China's Prosperity Mining Consortium, flanked by a team of impeccably dressed executives and legal advisors. This $4.8 billion investment will transform Burkina Faso's economy, announced Economy Minister Kabor to the assembled press. The development of our nation's lithium reserves represents a historic opportunity. The mood was celebratory. After years of struggling against Western economic exploitation, Burkina Faso appeared to have found a more equitable partner in China. The terms of the deal, as publicly announced, seemed remarkably favorable. Chinese investment in infrastructure, technology transfer, local employment guarantees, and a 60/40 profit-sharing arrangement in Burkina Faso's favor. As the formal proceedings began, documents were distributed around the table. The contract, nearly 200 pages thick, represented months of negotiations. Traoré's legal team had already reviewed the agreement multiple times, and his economic advisors were enthusiastic about its potential. Mr. President, this truly is a watershed moment, whispered Finance Minister Arago. With this investment, we can build schools, hospitals, modernize our military. Our people will finally see the benefits of our natural resources. Tru nodded, but something was bothering him. Throughout the negotiations, he had insisted on one key point. His young translator, Issa Kanat, would be present at all meetings. Kanat, educated in Beijing and fluent in Mandarin, was one of the few people in Burkina Faso who could understand the Chinese delegation's private conversations. Today, Kanat stood quietly behind Traoré, his expression uncharacteristically tense. The seeds of Traoré's suspicion had been planted 3 weeks earlier during a private dinner with Wei Jiang at the presidential palace. While discussing the potential deal over steaming plates of traditional Burkinabé cuisine, Wei had made a comment that struck Traoré as odd. Your lithium reserves are among the purest in the world. With proper management, they could sustain operations for generations to come. It wasn't what Wei said, but how he said it, with a subtle emphasis on generations that suggested something longer than the 25-year agreement they were negotiating. When Traoré questioned this, Wei had quickly backtracked, suggesting it was merely a translation issue. But later that evening, Kanat had approached him privately. Sir, the young translator had said, when Mr. Wei mentioned generations, he used a specific Mandarin term that implies perpetual control, not just a long-term arrangement. Since that night, Traoré had instructed Kanat to pay particular attention to discrepancies between what was being said in Mandarin and what was being translated. He had also ordered a more thorough review of the contract drafts. Though each revision seemed to address previous concerns, they introduced new, subtle language changes. Now, as the ceremonial speeches continued, Traoré opened the massive contract. Again, flipping to Section 17, dealing with national security and resource protection. Something about the wording had struck him as odd during his last review. Asterisk. The clause stipulated that Chinese security personnel would be stationed at the mining sites to protect their investment standard language in such agreements, but there was a subsection that referenced Appendix F, which contained additional security protocols. Traoré quietly turned to the appendix while Wei Jiang was delivering his speech about mutual prosperity and friendship between China and Africa. What he found in the appendix made his blood run cold. Hidden within the dense legal language was a provision granting Chinese security forces extraterritorial jurisdiction not just at the mining sites, but in a 50 kilometers radius around them. Moreover, these forces would have authority to neutralize threats to the mining operation without requiring approval from Burkina Faso authorities. With the planned mining sites strategically located near military installations and major cities, this effectively created Chinese security zones across critical areas of the country. Traoré's hands began to tremble slightly as he read further. The appendix also included provisions for automatic contract renewal that would be triggered under certain vaguely defined emergency conditions, essentially allowing the Chinese company to extend their control indefinitely. He thought back to his predecessor's fate. Former President Dimba had signed several similar agreements with foreign powers, only to be ousted when the true costs of those deals became apparent to the military and citizens. Traoré himself had risen to power promising to restore sovereignty over Burkina Faso's resources. Would he now betray that promise for short-term economic gain? His thoughts were interrupted by a discreet vibration from his phone. Glancing down, he saw a message from Colonel Wedriago, his head of military intelligence, greater than urgent. Chinese military attaché already discussing permanent base locations with Defense Minister Zongo. Intercepted communications. Suggest 5,000 plus. Security personnel plan. This confirmed his worst fears. The mining deal was a Trojan horse for establishing Chinese military presence in Burkina Faso, a country that had only recently managed to reduce French military influence after decades of post-colonial control. Mr. President. Kabor's voice broke through his concentration. They're waiting for your remarks before the signing. Traoré looked up to see all eyes on him. The Chinese delegation smiled expectantly. Cameras were ready. But as he glanced at Connaught, he caught a nearly imperceptible shake of the head from his young translator. Rising to his feet, Traoré smiled warmly at the assembled crowd. This is indeed a historic day, he began, his voice measured and calm despite the turmoil in his mind. For too long, Africa's resources have enriched others while our people remain in poverty. Today, we hope to begin a new chapter in how resource agreements are structured. Wei Jiang nodded enthusiastically, but a flicker of unease crossed his face as Traoré continued. Partnerships require transparency and mutual respect, Traoré said, picking up his copy of the contract. I find it interesting that the Mandarin version of our agreement contains several, shall we say, elaborations that are not present in the French text. The room fell silent. Wei Jiang's smile froze. Perhaps Mr. Wei can explain why. Appendix F grants Chinese security forces authority over sovereign Burkina Faso territory, Traoré asked, his voice still cordial but with steel beneath it. Or why the emergency provisions would allow this contract to be extended indefinitely without our consent. The Chinese delegation erupted in hurried whispers. Wei's translator began speaking rapidly into his ear, but the businessman's expression had already hardened. There must be some misunderstanding, Wei said smoothly after composing himself. Translation errors, perhaps. We can clarify these minor technical issues after the signing ceremony. Minor technical issues, Traoré repeated, raising an eyebrow. I would not consider granting foreign troops jurisdiction on Burkina Faso soil a minor issue, Mr. Wei. Wei's demeanor shifted subtly, his friendly expression giving way to something colder and more calculating. President Traoré, with respect, your country needs this investment. Your lithium reserves are worthless without the capital and technology to develop them. Perhaps you're overthinking certain standard protective clauses. Traoré maintained his composure, though he noted how quickly Ye had dropped a pretense of equality between their nations. Standard protective clauses that happen to be hidden in appendices and differ between language versions of the contract. Wei leaned forward. Let me be direct, Mr. President. My company has invested considerable resources in preparing this project. The Chinese government has authorized special economic assistance packages contingent on this agreement. Walking away now would be unwise for Burkina Faso's future. The threat was thinly veiled, and Traoré could see his own ministers shifting uncomfortably. Minister Kabor was visibly sweating, while Finance Minister Arago stared fixedly at the table, avoiding eye contact. Traoré's gaze didn't waver. I don't think so, Mr. Wei. What I'm looking at isn't a translation error. It's a deliberate attempt to secure control over not just our lithium, but our sovereignty. He closed the contract and placed it back on the table. Let me be clear. Burkina Faso welcomes investment partners. But we will not trade our independence for development funds, not to Western powers, and not to China either. The conference room erupted in chaos. Journalists rushed to file breaking stories. The Chinese delegation huddled in urgent consultation. Burkina Faso's ministers looked at each other in confusion and alarm as security personnel moved to clear the room. Traoré beckoned Kana to follow him to a side chamber. Once alone, he turned to the young translator. Tell me everything, he said simply. Kanat's words came in a rush. They've been planning this for months, sir. I overheard their legal team discussing it last week. They called it strategic expansion through contractual means. The security provisions were designed to establish a permanent Chinese presence. And there's more that isn't even in the contract plans to bring in thousands of Chinese workers rather than hiring locally. Secret agreements. With certain ministers. Which ministers? Traoré asked sharply. Connaught hesitated. Minister Kabor and Finance Minister Arago. They were promised significant personal compensation for ensuring the deal went through without scrutiny. Traoré absorbed this betrayal in silence. Then he asked, Why didn't you come to me sooner? I was gathering evidence, Connaught said, pulling out a small recording device. I have their conversations. In their private discussions, they referred to this as the new colonization economic control without the political backlash of military occupation. Before Traoré could respond, his security chief burst into the room. Sir, the Chinese delegation is threatening to withdraw all existing investments and projects. Minister Kabor is insisting you reconsider your position. I imagine he is, Traoré said quietly. He stood for a moment in thought, then straightened his shoulders, have the full cabinet assembled in 1 hour. And place Ministers Kabor and Arago under house arrest pending investigation for corruption. The security chief looked startled but nodded and left to carry out his orders. What now, Mr. President? Asked Khan at eacute. Without this investment? We'll find other partners, Traoré interrupted, or develop these resources ourselves, even if it takes longer. What we won't do is exchange Western colonizers for Eastern ones. He picked up Connaught's recording device. Make copies of this. We're going to address the nation tonight. Our people deserve to know when their sovereignty has been ended and when it has been traded away by those meant to protect it. Asterisk, as they prepared to leave the room, Conant asked hesitantly, "Sir, aren't you concerned about China's reaction? Their economic influence in Africa is enormous." Traoré paused at the door. "Of course I am. But there's something all these great powers fail to understand about nations like ours. After centuries of colonization and exploitation, we've learned that true independence is worth more than development that comes with hidden chains." Asterisk, the following hours were among the most intense of Traoré's presidency. The Chinese embassy issued an immediate condemnation of what they termed baseless accusations and diplomatic discourtesy. Economic advisors presented dire forecasts of retaliatory measures that could devastate Burkina Faso's already fragile economy. Several cabinet ministers threatened resignation, claiming Traoré was sacrificing development for ideological posturing. Asterisk, but Traoré remained resolute. Asterisk, in the emergency cabinet meeting, he played Conant's recordings, revealing the extent of Chinese duplicity and ministerial corruption. Some ministers appeared genuinely shocked. Others avoided his gaze entirely. Asterisk, I understand the economic arguments, Traoré told them. I know what we stand to lose. But I also know what we nearly lost today, our sovereignty, our dignity, and ultimately our future. Asterisk, he turned to defense. Minister ZONGO. General, I understand you've been discussing permanent base locations with Chinese military attaches. Perhaps you'd like to explain to your colleagues why you were negotiating military arrangements outside your authority. Asterisk, the defense minister's face drained of color. Asterisk, Mr. President, they approached me directly. They said it was part of the standard security package. I was told you had approved the preliminary discussions. Asterisk, and who told you that? Traoré asked, though he already knew the answer. Asterisk, Zongo glanced uncomfortably at the empty chairs where Kabor and Arago should have been sitting. Asterisk, Traoré nodded grimly. The corruption runs deeper than I thought. Any other ministers wish to confess their involvement before the evidence is presented? The silence in the room was deafening. That evening, as promised, Ibrahim Traoré addressed his nation. Seated at his desk with no ceremonial trappings, he spoke directly to the camera. Asterisk, today I rejected a $4.8 billion investment deal, he began. Not because Burkina Faso doesn't need investment, but because the price was our sovereignty. Asterisk, he explained. The hidden clauses played excerpts from Conant's recordings and outlined evidence of ministerial corruption. The address was simultaneously sobering and electrifying. Asterisk, by its conclusion, spontaneous gatherings had formed in cities across the country, with citizens rallying in support of their president's decision. Asterisk, we stand at a crossroads, Traoré continued. The easy path would be to accept these investments regardless of their hidden costs. The harder path, the path of true independence, requires sacrifice and patience. But I believe in the strength and resilience of our people. I believe we can develop our resources without surrendering our future. Asterisk, he announced a comprehensive anti-corruption investigation and a new transparency initiative requiring all international agreements to be published in full before ratification. Most boldly, he proposed the creation of a Pan-African resource development fund that would allow African nations to pool capital for developing strategic resources independently of foreign control. Asterisk, the challenges ahead are significant, he concluded. But remember this. Every resource in our soil belongs to the people of Burkina Faso, not just to this generation, but to all who will follow. I would rather leave our lithium in the ground than extract it at the cost of our children's freedom. Asterisk, the Response was immediate and overwhelming. Despite economic concerns, citizens took to the streets in support. National pride surged as Traoré's speech was shared across social media platforms and broadcast throughout the region. What might have been a political disaster instead became a rallying point for national unity. International reaction was swift and mixed. Western nations that had been losing influence in Africa to Chinese investment expressed hypocritical concern about economic stability. China issued formal denials of any impropriety, dismissing the recordings as fabrications. But across Africa, something more significant was happening. Within weeks, leaders from Ghana, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of Congo had requested